And tonight, with a major decision from the Supreme Court on Friday, dismissing a key charge used in hundreds of January 6 prosecutions. D.C. U.S. Attorney Matthew Graves says the court's decision affects 249 current cases, including some who have already been sentenced. Prosecutors charged hundreds of rioters with obstruction of an official proceeding, a crime that Congress created in the wake of the Enron scandal in the early 2000s. Jeffrey Fisher, a former Pennsylvania police officer who was charged with storming the Capitol, argued that the law only applies to the destruction of records or documents, physical evidence, rather than obstruction of Congress meeting to certify the electoral count on January 6th. The court agreed with him, tossing the charge, and that decision could affect the criminal cases against many, including former President Donald Trump. Joining us now is Trump's former defense attorney and the former chief of DOJ organized crime, Jim Trusty. Jim, first question for you. Have you ever seen the court strike down, or maybe the decision will have the effect of striking hundreds of criminal charges like this?
Yeah, I mean, every blue moon you see something that has retroactive effect, and all of a sudden the entire Department of Justice is scrambling to figure out, does it affect cases that have been going on for many years? This is a very, broad reach, widely reaching decision, important decision. It's really about separation of powers. And it goes, I think, to the heart of the notion that this Department of Justice, under this Attorney General, continues to be inventive and creative when they go after people whose politics they don't like. And so the Supreme Court has reined it in, basically saying Congress writes the laws. You don't get to expand the laws to fit your kind of political prosecutions. And I actually thought it was more like 330, but either way, hundreds of cases are going to be affected by this in terms of potential resentencing and perhaps even getting people completely out of prison.
Jeffrey Fisher is charged with at least 5 other crimes related to storming the Capitol that day. Justice Kavanaugh, during oral argument, asked the advocates for the government, isn't that enough? And they didn't seem to pull punches on the terrible nature of what happened that day to this country and to the Capitol. But they also seemed to suggest that there were other routes for seeking justice here. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, look, the bottom line is there's all sorts of different pieces of conduct that took place on January 6th. They range from people that literally went after police officers, assaulted officers, sprayed them with bear spray, did all sorts of terrible things towards the cops, to vandalism, to breaking and entering, and then to a whole class of people who barely did anything but get caught up in a protest that they may have thought was entirely lawful by the time they joined it. So there's a real wide swath of behavior that's been subjected to prosecution and no end in sight. It's kind of an industrial scale prosecution where they've created an office within the U.S. Attorney's Office devoted to January 6th, where they have endless resources in play on a national level, people volunteering from around the country and getting new positions from the Attorney General. So, when you have that kind of macro attack where everyone is considered subject to very serious and severe consequences, it tends to lead to abuse. And I think the Supreme Court here said, look, this statute's all about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Right. It was all about Enron, about documents, not anything else. And this Department of Justice, specifically the U.S. Attorney's Office, has reached beyond the intent of Congress to try to find a way to catch all this type of conduct within a serious 20-year felony charge. So
the U.S. Attorney's Office seemed to kind of try to tamp down the effects of today's decision on the cases that they have pending, perhaps in line with what your reasoning is there. But I want to ask you before we leave, what, if any, effect will this decision have on former President Trump's case where he is charged with obstruction in the January 6th case?
Yeah, great question. I think there's 2 counts of the same statute, 1512C, in his January 6th indictment. Jack Smith has already telegraphed in a pleading to the court that the Fisher opinion today bears no consequences for him, that he thinks that there's a theory by which President Trump was interfering with documentation by way of going after the electoral vote. Again, it's the same old story. It's an overreach, an over-aggressive, only for President Trump kind of approach. It may affect some of the other cases in D.C. They may try to find some sort of foolish consistency. But right now, it means that probably President Trump will have to file motions and litigate those counts, perhaps bringing them all the way back to the Supreme Court before he ever goes to trial.
And of course, we're waiting on that immunity decision that we now know will come down Monday. We'll have you back to discuss that as soon as we get it. Jim Trusty, longtime prosecutor, thanks for joining us.
Sure. Good to see you.